What if the country, sitting on some of the largest oil reserves on Earth, suddenly could not sell a single barrel? What if one small island, barely 5 miles long, decided whether gas prices around the world would explode overnight? Before we go further, if you care about understanding what is really happening in the world right now, hit that like button so more people see this. Subscribe if you want the full story, not just the headline. And if you know someone who keeps asking what is going on with Iran and oil prices, send them this video right now. They will thank you later. Let's start with the island itself, because almost nobody outside the oil industry had heard of it until this year. Kharg Island sits in the northern Persian Gulf, about 15 miles off the coast of Iran. It is small. You could walk across it in under 2 hours. But this tiny piece of land carries an almost unbelievable weight on its shoulders. Roughly 90% of every barrel of crude oil that Iran sells to the world leaves through this one island. Think about that for a second. Iran is a massive country. It has other ports, other coastlines, other pipelines, yet almost all of its oil, the lifeblood of its entire economy, funnels through a single loading point in the sea. There is no real backup. No other terminal has the deep water access needed to load the giant tankers that carry 2 million barrels at a time. If Kharg goes down, Iran does not have a plan B. It has nothing. That single fact is why military planners, oil traders, and world leaders have been watching this island so closely. In a normal year, Kharg moves somewhere between 1.1 and 1.5 million barrels of oil every single day. That oil funds a huge share of Iran's government. Analysts estimate that around half of Iran's entire national budget comes from oil and gas revenue. So when people talk about hitting Kharg Island, they're not talking about a military target. They're talking about switching off a nation's paycheck. To put that in perspective, imagine every gas station in an entire country connected to a single fuel pipe, and that pipe running through one narrow doorway that a rival army can watch, block, or destroy whenever it chooses. That is essentially the position Iran has been living in. Governments do not build their entire economy around one vulnerable point on purpose. It happened because building a second facility of that scale takes years, enormous investment, and calm political conditions, none of which Iran has had the luxury of enjoying for a long time. Sanctions, isolation, and limited access to foreign engineering firms all made expanding beyond Kharg extremely difficult. So the vulnerability sat there for decades, mostly ignored, until the moment it became the center of the entire conflict. Now let's talk about how we got here, because the tension around this island did not appear out of nowhere. For months, the conflict between the United States, Israel, and Iran had been climbing higher and higher. Missiles were fired. Warnings were issued. And somewhere in the middle of all this, the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow waterway that a huge share of the world's oil must pass through, became a battlefield of its own. Iran began interfering with shipping traffic through the strait. Tanker movements that used to average around 84 ships a day collapsed to fewer than 10. That alone was enough to send oil prices climbing. But the real fear, the fear that kept energy traders awake at night, was what would happen if the fighting reached Kharg Island itself. Every side in this conflict understood the same basic fact. Whoever controlled the outcome at Kharg Island controlled a piece of leverage bigger than almost any battlefield victory. You could win a dozen smaller engagements, and it would matter less than a single credible threat against that island. That is what made the waiting period before any real strike so tense. Analysts, traders, and government officials all watched the same satellite images, waiting to see if the war would cross that final line. And then it did. In mid-March, the United States launched a large-scale strike on Kharg Island. This was not a small operation. American forces hit more than 90 separate military targets in a single night. Missile storage bunkers were destroyed. Naval mine facilities were wiped out. The president at the time described it as a strike that totally obliterated every military target on what he called Iran's crown jewel. For a few hours, headlines across the world screamed that Iran's most important economic asset had just been hit. Oil prices jumped. Brent crude pushed back above $100 a barrel, a level the market had not comfortably sat above in years. But here is where the story gets more interesting than the headlines suggested. The strike specifically avoided the oil terminals themselves, the pumps, the loading jetties, the actual infrastructure that moves crude onto tankers. All of it was left standing. The military targets around the island were destroyed. The oil machinery was not touched. This was a deliberate choice, and it tells you everything about how this kind of pressure actually works. Before we go deeper into why that choice mattered so much, let's pause for a second. If this kind of breakdown is helping you actually understand the news instead of just scrolling past it, do me a favor and tap that subscribe button. I break down stories like this every week. The real mechanics behind the headlines, not just the panic. And if you have not liked the video yet, now is a great time. It genuinely helps this channel keep making videos like this one. So why would anyone destroy 90 military targets but leave the oil terminals standing? The answer comes down to one word: Leverage. If you completely destroy an enemy's oil infrastructure, you have used your biggest card. There's nothing left to threaten. But if you destroy everything around the oil terminals while leaving the terminals themselves untouched, you send an unmistakable message. We can reach you. We chose not to finish the job. And if you push us again, we will. That is exactly what happened here. The message was public, direct, and blunt. The strike was described as a warning shot. If Iran continued to block the Strait of Hormuz or attack commercial ships, the oil terminals on Kharg Island would be next. This is the part most viewers miss when they see a headline like 90% of Iran's oil gone overnight. The oil terminals were not physically destroyed. What actually threatened Iran's exports was something else entirely, a naval blockade. Around mid-April, the United States established a naval blockade around Kharg Island. This is different from a bombing raid. A blockade does not need explosions to work. It simply means warships position themselves in the waters around the island and prevent tankers from loading or leaving. No missiles are needed. The oil sits in storage tanks. The tankers sit empty, or worse, sit loaded and unable to move. In Iran's export numbers, the actual barrels leaving the country fall off a cliff. For days at a time in May, this blockade effectively shut down loadings at Kharg. Then, briefly, between mid-June and early July, there was a window where the pressure eased. During that short gap, Iran managed to push out somewhere between 40 and 70 million barrels, mostly heading toward buyers in Asia. It was a narrow opportunity, and Iran used it as fast as it could. But by the start of July, the restrictions snapped back into place. Kharg Island went quiet again, turned into what one report memorably called a parking lot for stranded tankers. So when you hear a title claiming 90% of Iran's oil disappeared overnight, here is the more accurate and honestly more fascinating version of events. It was not a single missile strike that erased Iran's oil exports. It was the threat of destruction combined with a suffocating naval blockade. The fear of losing everything, paired with the physical inability to move tankers, created almost the exact same economic effect as if the terminals had actually been bombed. Iran's main artery for oil money was choked, not once, but twice within a few months, without a single barrel of oil infrastructure being blown up. It also explains why so many news outlets got the framing wrong in the first place. A headline announcing that oil infrastructure was obliterated gets more clicks than a headline explaining a slow-moving naval blockade, even if the blockade is the part actually doing the damage. Complex, quiet pressure does not translate well into a 30-second clip, so the more dramatic and less accurate version usually wins the algorithm, even when it misleads the very people trying to understand what is happening. This is one of the most important lessons hidden inside this entire story. In modern conflict, you do not always need to destroy something to disable it. Sometimes the threat of destruction, backed by real military presence, does the job just as effectively, and it keeps your options open for later. Iran's leaders had to make decisions every single day, not knowing whether that morning's ships would be allowed to load, or whether the next message from Washington would mean the terminals themselves were finally on the target list. It is worth sitting with that idea for a moment, because it changes how you should read every future headline about this conflict. A blockade is quiet. There are no dramatic explosions to film, no fireballs for the news to replay. It just looks like ships sitting still in calm water. Yet that quiet picture was doing more economic damage, day after day, than a single loud missile strike ever could. Silence, in this case, was the weapon. Now, let's talk about what this actually meant for the world. Because this is not just a story about Iran. Oil is priced globally. When a country responsible for a meaningful share of global supply suddenly cannot move its product, the effects ripple outward immediately. Brent crude, the global benchmark, surged past $100 a barrel in the days following the initial strike. That number matters to more than traders in suits. It matters to a truck driver filling up bins. Another country. It matters to a family paying a heating bill. It matters to a factory that needs diesel to run its machines. Oil price shocks do not stay contained inside the country where the conflict is happening. They spread through the entire global economy within days. To try to calm the panic, the International Energy Agency coordinated an enormous release of oil from strategic reserves around the world, something in the range of 400 million barrels pulled from emergency stockpiles. Think about the scale of that number, 400 million barrels, released in a coordinated effort just to keep prices from spiraling completely out of control. That is not a small policy tweak. That is the international energy system pulling an emergency lever because one small island's fate had become a threat to global stability. If you are starting to see how interconnected all of this really is, one island, one blockade, one strike, and suddenly the entire planet feels it at the gas pump, then you already understand why this story deserves more attention than it gets. Well, do me one more favor before we continue. Share this video with someone who still thinks oil prices just randomly go up and down. Show them it is never random. There is always a reason, and usually that reason has a name, a location, and a history behind it. That single share helps this channel reach more people who actually want to understand the world instead of just reacting to it. There's also a psychological side to oil shocks that rarely gets discussed. Prices do not just rise because barrels physically disappear. They rise because traders start pricing in fear of what might happen next. The moment headlines suggested Iran's entire export system could be destroyed, markets reacted as if it already had been, long before any confirmation of the real damage came through. That is the strange nature of modern energy markets. Expectation moves prices just as powerfully as reality does. A credible threat against Kharg Island was, in financial terms, almost as disruptive as an actual strike, because traders had no way of knowing which version of the story they were living through until it was already over. Let's go deeper into why Iran could not simply reroute its oil somewhere else, because a lot of people assume a country can just find another way to sell what it produces. With Iran, that assumption falls apart fast. Kharg Island is not just one option among several. It is the only facility with the deep water jetties capable of loading the largest crude carriers, the ones that can hold up to 2 million barrels in a single trip. Smaller terminals exist along the coast, but none of them come close to matching Kharg's capacity or its ability to load ships fast enough to matter. Trying to replace Kharg with smaller ports would be like trying to replace a major international airport with a handful of small regional runways. The volume simply cannot move through in time. This is also why the difference between blocking the Strait of Hormuz and disabling Kharg Island matters so much to analysts. Blocking the Strait is a transportation problem. The oil still exists. It is sitting in storage, ready to move, but the route out is dangerous or closed. Eventually, when the route reopens, that oil can still reach the market. Disabling Kharg Island is a completely different kind of disruption. It does not just block the road. It shuts off the only door the oil has to leave the country in meaningful volume. That is the difference between a delay and a loss. Analysts have said clearly that the market had not truly priced in the worst case scenario the actual destruction of Kharg's oil terminals, because if that happened, the loss would not be temporary. It would fundamentally reshape global oil supply for months, possibly longer, while any kind of rebuilding took place. There's also the question of who actually pays the highest price during a squeeze like this. It is rarely the political leaders making the decisions. It is ordinary people, on both sides of the conflict, dealing with the fallout. Inside Iran, fuel shortages, inflation, and pressure on the national currency tend to hit regular families first, long before they hit anyone in a position of power. Outside Iran, drivers, farmers, airlines, and factories absorb the shock through higher prices on almost everything that depends on energy, which in the modern world is nearly everything. A conflict fought over one island in the Persian Gulf becomes, within days, a quiet tax on millions of people who never asked to be part of it. Despite everything happening around it, it is worth pointing out something that surprises a lot of people. Even under intense pressure, even with blockades and the constant threat of strikes, Iran still accounted for a meaningful share of global oil supply. And some analysts even noted that revenues briefly surged in certain windows because of how tight the overall market had become. Scarcity, ironically, can sometimes push prices up so high that even reduced volumes bring in serious money. War creates chaos, but chaos does not always mean less profit for everyone involved. It often means a strange, uncomfortable mix of loss and opportunity happening at the same time, depending on which day you check the numbers. Let's also talk about the human and strategic risk sitting underneath all of this, because a naval blockade and a military strike near a heavily defended island is not a clean, bloodless chess move. The area around Kharg and the wider Persian Gulf became one of the most dangerous stretches of water on the planet during this period. Iran has what is sometimes called a mosquito fleet, a large number of small, fast attack boats capable of carrying missiles, drones, or mines. These boats are hard to detect and hard to stop individually, and they gave Iran a way to strike back without needing large warships or aircraft. During the broader conflict, attacks reached surprisingly far. Refueling aircraft were damaged on the ground at a base in Saudi Arabia. Reports confirmed American personnel were affected in strikes across the region, even though officials stressed there were no deaths in that particular incident. The risk here was never contained to one island. It stretched across an entire regional network of bases, ships, and alliances, all connected by the same conflict. There is a broader historical pattern hiding inside this too. Oil choke points have shaped conflicts for nearly a century, long before. Kharg Island existed as a modern terminal. Wars have been fought over pipelines, canals, and straits precisely because controlling the flow of energy has always meant controlling leverage over entire nations. What makes this moment different is speed. In earlier decades, a blockade might take weeks to actually affect prices at home. Today, with instant global trading and real-time satellite tracking of tankers, the entire world can watch a blockade tighten in real time, and prices can move within hours of a single warship changing position. The distance between a decision made in a control room and a price spike felt at a gas pump has almost completely disappeared. This is exactly why the decision to strike military targets while sparing the oil terminals was so carefully calculated. Every additional strike raised the odds of a mistake, a miscalculation, a retaliation that spirals further than anyone intended. Military and political leaders were not just thinking about oil prices. They were thinking about how close this entire situation was to becoming something much bigger, a wider regional war that could pull in more countries, more military assets, and far higher human costs. Kharg Island became the symbol of that balancing act. Hit it hard enough to send a message, not hard enough to remove any reason for restraint. We are getting close to the most important part of this story, so if this video is genuinely helping you understand a topic that most news coverage rushes through in 30 seconds, do something simple for me. Drop a comment with one word that describes how this story makes you feel, whether that is worried, fascinated, or something else entirely. It helps this video reach more people, and honestly, I read every single one. So where does this leave us now, and why should any of this matter to someone who has never thought twice about a small island in the Persian Gulf? The answer comes down to a single, uncomfortable truth about the modern world. Almost everything we depend on, fuel, plastics, shipping, heating, manufacturing, traces back through a small number of choke points controlled by a small number of decisions. Kharg Island is one of those choke points. The Strait of Hormuz is another. When tension rises around either of them, the effects do not stay local. They travel through global markets in days, sometimes hours, and they land directly in the wallets of people who have never even looked at a map of the Persian Gulf. What makes the Kharg Island situation so remarkable is how much power sat in the space between action and threat. The United States never fully destroyed the oil terminals. It did not need to. The mere possibility, backed by real strikes on nearby military assets and a real blockade choking off shipments, was enough to cripple Iran's export capacity for extended stretches of time. That is a different kind of warfare than most people picture when they think about international conflict. It is not always about total destruction. Sometimes it is about controlled pressure, applied precisely and held there long enough to force a decision. For Iran, the stakes could not be higher. With roughly half of government revenue tied to oil and gas, every blocked shipment, every stranded tanker, every day the blockade holds, translates directly into strain on the country's ability to function. Wages, subsidies, military spending, all of it depends heavily on oil money flowing out through that one narrow gateway. When that gateway closes, even temporarily, the pressure builds fast, and it builds in a way that is very hard to hide from the public. There's also a longer-term question hanging over all of this that most coverage never asks. What happens to a country's economy after months of stop-and-start blockades, even if the terminals themselves survive completely intact? Businesses cannot plan around uncertainty. Buyers overseas start looking for more reliable suppliers, even if it costs them a little more, simply because reliability has its own value. Every week that ships sit idle near Kharg Island, Iran risks losing not just short-term revenue, but long-term trust from the countries that buy its oil. Contracts get renegotiated. Alternative suppliers get a foot in the door. Even if the blockade eventually lifts completely, some of that lost business may never fully come back, because customers who found a steady alternative supplier during the crisis have very little reason to switch back once the danger is past. For the rest of the world, the lesson is just as important. Energy security is not something that exists quietly in the background forever. It can be shaken by a single decision made thousands of miles away, in a conflict most people never expected to affect their daily life. The 400 million barrels released from global reserves were not just a policy decision. They were proof that the entire planet's energy stability can hinge on the fate of one small island most people had never heard of before this year. It also raises a question that governments far outside the Middle East have quietly started asking themselves. If one small island can trigger a coordinated release of 400 million barrels from global reserves, what does that say about how fragile the entire system really is? Countries that import large amounts of oil have been forced to look harder at their own emergency stockpiles, their own backup suppliers, and their own exposure to a single region of the world. In that sense, the Kharg Island crisis did not just threaten Iran. It exposed how much of the modern global economy still depends on a handful of narrow, fragile points that almost nobody thinks about until they are suddenly in danger. So the next time you see a headline claiming a country's oil has vanished overnight, remember what actually happened here. It is rarely one dramatic moment. It is a sequence, strikes that stop just short of total destruction, blockades that choke without a single explosion, threats that carry as much weight as missiles. Kharg Island did not disappear. Its oil did not vanish in a single night. And what happened was slower, quieter, and in some ways far more unsettling, a demonstration of how a handful of ships and a handful of decisions can bring one of the world's oldest oil powers to a standstill without a single terminal being destroyed. That is the real story behind the headline. Not a single explosive night that ended everything, but a long, tense standoff where the mere possibility of destruction became a weapon all on its own. And as long as Kharg Island remains the only real gateway for Iran's oil, that possibility will keep hanging over every ship, every tanker, and every barrel that tries to leave its shores. If this video helped you finally understand what has actually been happening with Iran, oil prices, and Kharg Island, that is exactly why this channel exists. Hit subscribe if you want to keep seeing the real story behind the headlines. Tap like if you learned something new today, and share this with one person who still thinks oil prices just go up for no reason. They do not. There's always a reason. Now you know exactly what it is.